Topic 3, History Revision 3.1. This is how Hitler challenged and exploited the Treaty of Versailles from March 1933, from 1933 to March 1938. To start off in this section, it's vital that we understand Hitler's aims in foreign policy. And he'd made these clear in a book that he wrote in 1924, Mein Kampf. And in his comments, his aims can be summarised as making Germany into a great power again, uniting all German-speaking people under his rule. So those are his first two aims. And a third key aim was to gain territory for Germany in the east. What this was called was Lebensraum. Lebensraum was German for living space, to provide for the German people. Now, in order to achieve this, Hitler had to essentially destroy the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, from its creation in 1919, imposed terms on Germany, what Germans felt were very harsh. It was a symbol of Germany's defeat and would stop Germany regaining many of its former powers. The terms of the treaty restricted Germany's land, population, armed forces, and also meant Germany paid significant reparations. So, in order for Hitler to be able to remove the treaty and meet his key aims in foreign policy, he had to regain the lands such as the Saar and Danzig that were inhabited by German speakers. So one of the methods in terms of uniting German speakers was regaining lands such as the Saar and Danzig that had been taken away from Germany. Three other key areas that Hitler could gain German speakers would be, first of all, Austria, where there were 7 million German speakers. Austria was not part of Germany, but shared similar language, or same language, and very similar culture. There were 4 million German speakers in Czechoslovakia and in Poland. Out of those, 3 million were in the Sudetenland. So 3 million German speakers in the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. Now, for Hitler to regain or can take control of these lands, the treaty would need to be ripped up and destroyed. Now, the treaty had forbidden Germany from uniting with Austria and had taken German lands away, part of which had become Czechoslovakia and Poland. Another area that Hitler would need to expand was the German army. The Treaty of Versailles had reduced the army to 100,000 men, and this was not going to be enough to make Germany a great power. So the army, air force and navy would need to be expanded. Now, Hitler's aim of achieving Lebensraum was most likely going to come in the east against the USSR. So the USSR was likely to be the country where Hitler was targeting for Lebensraum. So more space and more materials for German people. USSR was communist and Hitler's Germany was fascist, which were direct opposites and sworn enemies, essentially. Now, in order to build explanations about Hitler's foreign policy, we've done that already by explaining why Hitler wanted to overturn the treaty, why he wanted to regain lands in the east, why he wanted Lebensraum, why he wanted to build his armed forces up. To make it better explanations, you should use examples of, for land, Saar, Danzig, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, for German speakers, you should particularly use Austria, Sudetenland, and for example Danzig. These are areas or examples of countries which show what Hitler wanted to gain and why. Now, in this section and all of topic 3, one of the key essay areas is to explain and to assess why Hitler's actions and those actions of Britain and France in allowing him to achieve his aims would cause war. Now, most essay questions, 10-mark essay questions in this unit, will be along the lines of which of these events was most important cause for the outbreak of war, or which of these events was the most important reason for peace being threatened in the 1930s. And what I would stress here to assess the importance of this Hitler's foreign policy is that this will bring his key aims in foreign policy will bring him into conflict inevitably with Britain and France. It would also, ultimately, when he was powerful enough, bring him into conflict with the USSR. France had just fought 2 major wars against Germany in 1870-71 and then in the First World War, and were not keen to allow German expansion. Britain, although willing to allow some concessions to Germany, did not want Germany to dominate Europe. And certainly the USSR would be concerned about Hitler spreading into the East. Now, a key section that will often come up on describe questions in this unit, which are 4-mark, 5-minute describe questions. And it could be along the lines of describe German rearmament or features of German rearmament. Or it could come up in an essay question to assess how German rearmament contribute to the outbreak of war. What we should do in terms of description is that for rearmament in 1932, when there was a disarmament conference, little progress had been made in Europe on disarmament. Countries had not reduced their armament significantly, although Germany had to. Germany attended the disarmament conference in 1932 and into 1933. But Hitler, in 1933, not long after coming to power, withdrew Germany from the disarmament conference. He also withdrew Germany from the League of Nations in 1933. Although Germany had been forbidden from joining the League, when it was created in 1920. They did join in 1926. So Hitler pulls them out in 1933. In terms of explanation of why Hitler claims that he needs to rearm and why he needs to pull Germany out of the disarmament conference, is that he said he would be prepared to disarm if other countries did. France, however, would never disarm because they feared another German attack. So the French reasoning for not disarming was that they feared a third German attack, and actually with good cause in the end. Hitler claims that it's only safe for Germany to have a similar army as other countries, and Germany began to rearm. And the first real key feature of this was introducing conscription in 1935. Now, conscription would mean that all German men of a certain age would need to join the armed forces. This had been forbidden in the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler's reason for conscription, now in terms of explaining why he does this, is that France had just increased its own length of conscription from 12 months to 18 months. So the French had conscription, and the German justification is that they should too, for their own security. Now the French would now have more trained soldiers, so Hitler believed that Germany should also have this. Now, in terms of explanations, in this section, in topic 3, you should first of all, in an essay, look at briefly describing what Hitler wanted or what he did. All the points that come into play looks at what Hitler did. You should then look at explanations of why things happened. You get more marks for explanation than you do for description. That's why you keep description brief. For explanation, you look at why Hitler did things, why he took action. You should also consider another explanation of why Britain and France took no action, or why Britain and France acted in a certain way. Now, we're not telling a story, we're saying why they did it. And in this case, Britain and France don't act. The only opposition that forms, really, is the Strasser Front, which you may remember from the Abyssinian crisis, to protest against the introduction of conscription in Germany. And the Strasser Front included Britain, France and Italy. The Soviet Union joined the League of Nations at this time also, in 1934. Britain's reasoning for not taking action against German rearmament, because remember this was banned in the Treaty of Versailles. The reason for Britain is that many people in Britain, many politicians and some of the public, felt that the Treaty of Versailles was unfair and too harsh and needed to be revised, altered. The French were more concerned with German recovery and wanted to see the treaty strengthened, but they would not act alone. The French had the army to be able to deal with this, to threaten Germany, but they didn't feel they had the support of other European nations, particularly Britain, although the French could have acted if they had chosen to. The danger for France is it was difficult to actually take action. Even though they had the option to, it was difficult. They lacked support. When they'd invaded the Ruhr and taken control of the Ruhr in 1923, because Germany had fallen behind in reparations payments, this had failed. And it caused tension between France and Britain. It starts to become clear that Britain has many sympathies with Germany because they feel the treaty is too harsh. Hitler is very clever in taking advantage of British and French differences in order to further his own policies. And he was very clever in doing this during rearmament. He often threatens to use force to achieve his aims and then doesn't actually use force. He manages to achieve aims simply by the threat of force. Now, if we look at particular examples of rearmament, you should include conscription. You also have the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. As part of that, you could use examples such as the German army reaching around about 800,000 people by 1938. And by 1938, they also had 47 U-boats and 2,000 aircraft. So these are significant examples of how the German army, navy and air force expanded. Now, smaller examples here, we have the 10-year Non-Aggression Pact, failed Anschluss, Anglo-German Naval Agreement and the return of the Tsar are smaller episodes. They're not as significant in size as the Rhineland and the Anschluss. They are more likely to appear in described questions and quite frequently used in described questions. And you'll be asked to describe, for example, the failed Anschluss and events of it, or the 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland. So, to take the first one, in 1934, Hitler agrees a 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland. And to describe the terms of this, it guaranteed the boundaries of Poland for 10 years. And actually, the Poles are satisfied that Hitler would not try to take back the Polish corridor. The Polish corridor had been taken from Germany in the Treaty of Versailles. For Hitler, this also had the benefit of pleasing Britain, who saw it as proof that Hitler was essentially being peaceful in his methods and his aims, and that Germany had accepted the frontier of Poland that had been set up at Versailles. Now, actually, what Hitler does as part of the Polish Non-Aggression Pact is he breaks with tradition in setting up good relations with Poland, because they hadn't been particularly good in the past. What this is an example of is Hitler's clever foreign policy. The idea of appearing peaceful, but actually, behind the scenes, aiming to be aggressive. It was set up in 1934 as a 10-year pact of non-aggression, but by 1939 Hitler had invaded Poland. So it was false. Another example, a smaller example of an event during this period, is the failed Anschluss of 1934. The Anschluss would be the union of Germany and Austria, which Hitler intended to happen and was one of his key aims. It would meet the uniting of German speakers, which is one of his 3 key aims. But it was a setback in 1934, because what Hitler had done was encourage the Austrian Nazi Party to rebel. And again, as part of the description of this event, it resulted in the murder of the Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss. Hitler's aims of reuniting or uniting Germany and Austria at this time, in the Anschluss, looked like it was going to be achieved. But Mussolini, who at this time was not an ally of Hitler, moved his army to the frontier or the boundary of Italy and Austria. And this made sure that the Austrians kept independence and the Anschluss failed in 1934. This showed to Hitler the importance of an alliance with Mussolini, which he eventually agreed in the Rome-Berlin Axis in 1936. Hitler backs down as his army is not strong enough in 1934. He's only come to power in 1933, and secret rearmament has not been enough at this stage to produce a strong army. He denies involvement with the Austrian Nazi Party and moves on. In 1935, we have a next event, which is the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. This was a success for Hitler. It was agreed between Britain and Germany that Germany could build up to 35% of the size and strength of the British fleet. So just over a third of the British fleet. Submarines were not included in this agreement. What it did for Britain was proved that Hitler was peaceful in his intentions and was willing to talk. What the problem of this for Britain was, and maintaining the Treaty of Versailles, was that they had clearly broken the treaty, Britain here, by allowing Hitler to rearm his navy. Only 6 battleships had been allowed in the Treaty of Versailles, but Hitler has now been able to build his navy up to 35% of the British fleet. So Britain is agreeing to this, but they also felt, as a reason for this, that it was better to have a limit on the German navy than to allow him to do it freely. So they were placing a 35% limit on the size of the German navy. So it was in their interest to do this. It is an example of self-interest from Britain. It was a big success for Hitler because it weakens the stressor front between Britain, France and Italy, and shows the Italians that Britain were not willing to act always in the best interests of Europe and would act in their own interests where necessary. Britain had not consulted with France and Italy, and France and Italy were not happy with it. British took this action. Another event in 1935, also to coincide with the Anglo-German Naval Agreement and at the same time the introduction of German conscription, was the return of the Tsar to Germany. This happened in January 1935 when a plebiscite was held. That was a vote in the Tsar to decide whether it should remain under the control of the League of Nations. So in the Treaty of Versailles, it had been decided that the Tsar would be put under the control of the League of Nations for 15 years. And at the end there would be a vote. And this happens, and by choice, the German people could either become part of Germany, again, under German control, join France, or remain under the control of the League. They voted in large numbers, 90%, to rejoin Germany. This was significant for Hitler because Nazi propaganda could make it a great victory. It was seen as a removal of the injustice of Versailles and at the same time as a vote of confidence for Hitler and his policies, that people in the Tsar wanted to become fully under the control of Germany again. So it was celebrated in Germany, and essentially Hitler said that he'd removed grievances between France and Germany now. It was legal. This was a legitimate action, and a democratic vote took place. He kept within the treaty at all this time, and it was a big success also because the Tsar had significant amounts of coal, which was good for the German economy. Now we come to our two of the more major events in this section, 3.1 of 1933 to 38, and the first of these is the remilitarization of the Rhineland. A very frequently used topic, which description questions could be how Hitler described the Rhineland, the events of it. It's frequently used in essays of why it contributed to the outbreak of war and threats to peace, and also used in source questions as well, where explanation is built into this. In terms of the description, what happens is that on the 7th of March 1936, German soldiers reoccupied or marched into the Rhineland. The Rhineland was always part of Germany. I should not say that it was not part of Germany, it was. But Germany, in the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, were not allowed to keep troops or weapons in the Rhineland. It was done to separate them and France, to create a buffer for France, for protection. It was also agreed in the Locarno Pact in 1925 that the boundaries agreed in the Treaty of Versailles should remain. So what Hitler does, breaks the Treaty of Versailles and the freely agreed 1925 Locarno Pact. It's a classic example of Hitler giving promises at the same time as aggression. Because as he enters the Rhineland, he gives a promise of a 25-year non-aggression pact and that he had no more ambitions for territory in Europe. The League of Nations should have acted against this. It was a clear breach of the treaty. But there's only Soviet Russia that votes in favour of imposing sanctions on Germany. So action should have been taken, but wasn't. For explanation of why this happens, for Hitler, this is a key step to returning Germany to the status of a great power. The Rhineland not being under full German control, in terms of allowing its armed forces to be stationed there, was a major source of embarrassment for Hitler and the German people. It was not regaining German speakers because the Rhineland was already part of Germany. The big explanation that's used here is why Britain and France did not take further action. This is one of the reasons is because that Britain felt that Germany was taking back under its control its own land. And one of the reasons given by a British politician, Lord Lothian, is that Germany was only going into her own back garden, which is a classic explanation to use. Britain felt the treaty was too harsh, Treaty of Versailles, and they felt that Germany had genuine grievances and that they were doing nothing wrong in moving troops into its own territory. France should have acted because this was a clear threat to its future security, but they would not do so without the support of Britain. And at the time, the French government was divided, couldn't decide upon taking action against Germany. Another reason for Britain and France not taking action was that at the time they were more concerned about the Abyssinian crisis. So this takes place in 1936 at the height of the Abyssinian crisis. What Mussolini was doing was invading another country in Abyssinia. The excuse in the Rhineland example is that Hitler was only moving troops back into an area of his own country. Really, Britain and France were not willing to go to war and not willing to risk war at this time. And at the end of March, Hitler held a vote in Germany on his policies. 99% of those who voted were in favour of them. However, the validity of that vote should come into question, as many of the votes under Hitler's regime were rigged. When Hitler enters there and the German troops, it's to the great support, really, of the Rhineland people. Lots of flags waved, used in propaganda, but generally it was welcomed in the Rhineland. This is a major event in contributing to the outbreak of war in 1939. It's really, I suppose, a key turning point that you could say. Because if Britain and France had taken action against Hitler in 1936, it's likely that he could have been stopped. And this is what you should stress when you're assessing its impact. Hitler enters the Rhineland against the advice of his generals. So there was a missed opportunity for Britain and France to turn Hitler's generals in the army against Hitler. The German army considered that they were not strong enough to resist if the French army opposed them, because the French army was much bigger and stronger at this time. He also does it against the advice of his financial ministers, who said that sanctions would be dangerous for Germany economically. His generals did have orders to withdraw if they were opposed by the French, so this is a big missed opportunity. It's a major contribution to the outbreak of war because Hitler gained confidence from the remilitarization of the Rhineland, because he'd now successfully reversed the Treaty of Versailles, and gave him the confidence to move on to another area, which is Austria, and to move on to the Anschluss. It also gives him the confidence to remove future grievances, such as regaining Danzig and the Polish corridor. And it's important that he use examples rather than just say that Hitler gained confidence. His position in Germany is strengthened. He gains more support from his generals, who had been wary of Hitler and not had much trust in him. He'd proved his ministers and his army generals wrong. Again, his confidence is increased, and it's also backed up by him signing the Rome-Berlin Axis with Mussolini in Italy in 1936. And Germany agrees to cooperate in Italian support for the fascist General Franco in the Spanish Civil War. So Hitler and Mussolini are now allied to each other and working together, which was a big step in the wrong direction for European peace. It essentially also marks the end of the League of Nations as a peacekeeping force. Along with the Abyssinian crisis and the remilitarization of the Rhineland, 1936 really brings the end of the League. Now, for our final event in this section is the Anschluss with Austria. Again, a major area in topic 3, which can be used as quite a significant amount of description of describing the events of how Hitler was able to carry out the Anschluss, but it can also be used a lot in essay questions of how it contributes to the outbreak of war in 1939, but also in source questions. And the same format. In terms of description, we should state that Hitler had failed in 1934 to reunite Germany and Austria, and it's shown at that time that Mussolini's help would be significant because the Italians had prevented the Anschluss in 1934. By 1938, Mussolini was now allied with Germany and would not oppose Hitler's attempts to reunite with Austria. He was occupied in the Spanish Civil War alongside Hitler and German troops, and Austria would not get Italy's support at this time. The way Hitler goes about it is that, again, the Austrian Nazi Party are given encouragement by Hitler, and the party remains strong in Austria. The Austrian Chancellor, Schuschnigg, difficult spelling, appealed to Hitler for help to end plotting by the Nazi Party in Austria to overthrow the Austrian government. Hitler refuses this and puts pressure on Schuschnigg. He really wants Schuschnigg to step down, but he puts pressure on him to approve and appoint Seyss-Inquart as Minister of the Interior. So a key position in Austria. Seyss-Inquart was the leader of the Nazi Party in Austria. Now, there are riots and demonstrations by the Nazis, and this is encouraged by Hitler. So these riots and demonstrations against the Austrian government are important in bringing about the downfall of the Austrian government. So Seyss-Inquart and Hitler both support this. Schuschnigg tries to save the independence of Austria and to end the disturbances by calling a plebiscite, a vote, on whether the Austrian people wanted independence or to become part of Germany. So Schuschnigg has taken a bold step. Now this alarms Hitler, because actually there were many Austrians who favoured Anschluss, but many who would want to remain independent. And Hitler is not prepared to take this risk. And what Hitler decides to do is he moves his troops to the border with Austria, and he puts pressure on Schuschnigg to step down. And what Hitler is doing is forcing Schuschnigg to call off the plebiscite and to resign. What Schuschnigg is faced with the option of is bloodshed and fighting between Germany and Austria, which Austria would certainly lose, or step down and accept Germany be taking over and taking control of Austria. Now what we've done here is given a lot of description, and that's a key in Austria, in the Anschluss, in this section, because this often comes up as a described question. And Seyss-Inquart replaced Schuschnigg as Chancellor and invited the Germans into Austria to restore order. It's a clever tactic used time and again by Hitler to appear peaceful but actually be aggressive. So as he enters, he doesn't look like a conqueror, he looks like someone who's restoring peace. And on the 12th of March, the Germans enter. In terms of explanation of this, what we should stress is that Hitler is achieving one of his key aims here. So why he's doing it, he has the aim of reuniting Germany and Austria. First of all, he is Austrian, and he believes that Germany and Austria share a common culture, language, and a history. He's also keen to acquire the 7 million German speakers in Austria, and would acquire raw materials and land from Austria. So as economic resources of iron and steel. So Hitler's reasons are clear, and it would most likely take a big step towards making Germany a great power again. Britain and France's reaction is important in terms of explaining it. Britain, very similar to the Rhineland, don't act because they believe that Germany has ties with Austria, and that mostly Austrians are German speaking and have a tradition in German culture. So there are ties between the two countries. Same language, same culture. Many similar traditions. They do, however, protest to the League of Nations, so they take an extra step. The French government will not act without Britain. And Britain at this time were all the more concerned about communism spreading from the USSR. They believed that Hitler and a strong Germany, Nazism, would act as a barrier to the USSR and communism, spreading across Europe. As Hitler is an anti-communist, they believed that he would stop the spread of communism against Europe, which they actually feared more than Nazism. The slight bit of description again, but the Austrians agree in a plebiscite in April 1938, with 99.75% of them agreeing to become part of Germany. The likelihood is this vote was rigged again. Hitler regains the power from Seyss-Inquart, and Austria becomes part of Germany in March 1938. Now our final part for this section is to assess its impact and the results of this, and you should always consider what happens next. It's absolutely vital for Germany and Austria, and it makes a big contribution to the outbreak of war and threats to peace. It's a triumph for Hitler, as he now has 7 million new German speakers at his disposal. So that's industrial workers, soldiers, and also many economic resources such as iron and steel. He's been successful in Germany, again, and proved that he's a master of foreign policy, and that he's removed another injustice of the treaty because this had been forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. One of the key points you should mention is that this has an impact on the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, because Hitler now has control of 3 sides of Czechoslovakia. and they're surrounding the Sudetenland on its western borders. 3 million German speakers were in the Sudetenland, and having taken Austria, this could now be Hitler's next aim, which would make a further step towards war. This was absolutely vital for Hitler and a massive step towards war, because Hitler has proved again to his generals and his armed forces that he has been successful and that he deserves the confidence of the German people. It's clear that he can now move on to his next step, and his aggressive ambitions have not been stopped, and he can move on to Czechoslovakia, and eventually in 1939, when he's strong enough and his armed forces are strong enough, Poland. Those issues will be considered in 3.2 in next week's broadcast. Thank you.